a bit more information. Ebony Bennett now from the Australia Institute, who I believe can join us now live. Ebony, thanks so much for speaking to us here at Ticker.
Thanks for having me.
From the Australian perspective, we've seen sanctions being announced from the federal government, both the Federal Liberal Party but also Labor signing up to this, saying that we need to do this. The question is, of course, what can stop Vladimir Putin right now?
Well, certainly it won't be Australian sanctions, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison acknowledged as much today. Australia is obviously standing with the Ukraine and Europe against this aggression from Russia, but the reality is we don't have huge trade with Russia, so it's really just for show at this point. And certainly President Vladimir Putin has taken a lot of steps to insulate Russia against the effectiveness of sanctions. They don't have a lot of government debt and also huge cash reserves is my understanding. So I think it's important, though, that the world is showing a united front against this aggression, and sanctions are an important part of that. Ukraine itself is targeting lawmakers who approved the independence of these two eastern Ukrainian parts of the country. So people are looking to do very targeted sanctions at this point, still leaving some things, I think, in reserve for down the track. And certainly the focus has been on targeting the Russian economy, preventing them from access to finance in Europe and accessing debt, that kind of thing. But, it doesn't appear that that's going to stop President Vladimir Putin anytime soon. And so I think everyone is hoping against hope that sanctions plus diplomacy will still win out. But certainly the United States is extremely worried, although how much store we can put in their intelligence when they've been predicting an imminent attack for almost a month now, I guess is anyone's guess.
It's an interesting situation in that Australia often thinks about its relationship with China, of course, the same way that Europe looks at its relationship with Russia, in that we're not quite happy with some of the decisions you're making, but we are reliant on you. From the European perspective, it's in terms of natural gas and other resources. From the Australian perspective, it's the almighty dollar when it comes to buying iron ore and reserves and things like that as well. And also the fact that the Chinese have prevented their companies from being able to buy Australian goods and products as well. What lessons do you think that Australia can learn in our relationship with China from what we're seeing between Europe and also Russia in terms of that over-reliance on a country where you just simply aren't getting along?
Yeah, you've got an absolutely great point there. Australia's in a very similar situation with a big superpower on our doorstep, who's also a large trading partner. That is a two-way street, and I thought it was really interesting that the German Chancellor had taken the steps of removing support for Nord Stream 2 going ahead. Russia obviously trying to insulate itself from sanctions, but it also relies on Germany and Europe as customers for its gas. So that's a two-way street. That's similar in Australia, though we're obviously much smaller with a much smaller defence force than China. We still have power in that relationship. China's very heavily dependent on Australian iron ore, for example. So there are levers that we could pull. But the real lessons that Australia can learn here for our region is that we have to invest in peace. We have to invest in diplomacy and in really building up allies in our region and closer relationships, in particular with countries like Indonesia, the Republic of South Korea and Japan, to really find ourselves not on our own, but as part of a concerted effort to encourage China to behave responsibly as a superpower and to engage with people constructively, with countries constructively and not aggressively. So I think there are huge lessons for Australia to draw on here, that we can't all just leave it to the last minute. And when things with the relationship have deteriorated, it actually takes a huge investment to build strong relationships with allies over time. And unfortunately, we've seen a huge underinvestment, particularly in diplomacy and particularly in our region.
Is it time for countries like Australia, though, to increase funding on things like defence. We have seen the United States, we have seen the UK, we've even seen Canada sending plane loads of military hardware to Ukraine. Do you think we should be, Australia should be assisting in that regard when it comes to military hardware? And would you also like to see the defence budget in Australia, which some say is frighteningly low given the situation in the region, actually be increased?
Well, I think there's been a shift in Australian defence policy in recent years. It used to be very much focused on the defence of Australia, and certainly with the AUKUS agreement, there's been a shift to becoming part of a forward defence, securing hunter-killer submarines that would be part of any anticipated aggression from China in the future. That's very different from trying to defend Australia's borders. So I think there already has been a shift in Australia, and potentially not a good one. I'm not sure that it's in Australia's national interest to be sending arms to the Ukraine and to become part of this conflict. I think the sanctions are sensible, but we would want to think very long and hard before further engaging in any type of military escalation.
Okay, Ebony Bennett, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.